Picture this. It's November 1841, and the worst blizzard in 20 years is hammering the Rocky Mountains. We're talking about snow falling so thick you can't see your own hand stretched out in front of your face. The wind is howling like some prehistoric beast, and the temperature has dropped so low that spit freezes before it hits the ground. This is the kind of weather that kills people. Period. No discussion, no second chances. And yet, through this absolute wall of white death, a figure emerges at Skull Ridge Pass. Not stumbling, not barely surviving, but walking with the confident stride of someone who knows exactly where he's going. This is our introduction to Jake Brennan, though nobody knew his name yet. To the few hardy souls who might have glimpsed this apparition through the storm, he would have looked like something out of a fever dream. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Brennan wasn't your typical frontier wanderer. For the past decade, he'd been living among the Shoshone and Ute peoples, learning their ways, their survival techniques, their intimate knowledge of this brutal landscape. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Jake wasn't just some white man gone native. He was an engineer. Before heading west, he'd spent 5 years working on canal systems in Pennsylvania. He understood water flow, thermal dynamics, structural engineering. Now imagine combining that technical knowledge with 10 years of Native American survival wisdom. That's what was walking through that blizzard. The cabin he was heading for had been abandoned for 3 years. Samuel Morrison, a would-be prospector with more dreams than sense, had thrown together this shelter using whatever materials he could scrounge. Morrison had lasted exactly 1 winter before deciding that maybe gold wasn't worth freezing to death for. Smart man, actually. The cabin he left behind was a disaster waiting to happen. Gaps in the walls you could stick your fist through, a roof that leaked like a sieve, and a heating system that was basically just a hole in the floor with some rocks around it. But Jake Brennan looked at this wreck and saw something completely different. He saw potential. Those first 72 hours were crucial, and this is where Jake's unique background really showed itself. While most people would have been focused on just surviving the storm, Jake was already implementing a master plan. He'd learned snow cave techniques from the Ute, but he wasn't just building a temporary shelter. He was using the snow as insulation while he completely rebuilt the cabin's infrastructure. Here's where it gets fascinating from an engineering perspective. Jake started mixing his own mortar using clay from a nearby creek bed, dried grass he'd gathered before the storm hit, and here's the kicker: buffalo blood. Now, before you think this sounds like some kind of frontier voodoo, modern testing has shown that this mixture created insulation with 3 times the thermal efficiency of anything else being used in that era. 3 times. We're talking about a guy in 1841 accidentally creating a building material that wouldn't be matched by conventional construction for another 50 years. But the blood wasn't just for insulation. Jake understood something that most builders of his time didn't grasp: moisture control. Buffalo blood contains proteins that, when dried, create a water-resistant barrier. Combined with the clay and grass, he was essentially creating an early form of what we'd now call vapor barrier technology. The man was intuiting principles of building science that wouldn't be formally understood until the 20th century. The transformation of that cabin wasn't just about survival, it was about proving a point. Jake had spent a decade watching native peoples create comfortable, efficient shelters using materials that white settlers completely ignored. He'd seen Shoshone earth lodges that stayed warm in sub-zero temperatures, Ute winter camps that required minimal fuel to heat, but he'd also learned European timber techniques from his canal building days. What he was creating at Skull Ridge Pass was a fusion of technologies that shouldn't have been possible. By the 3rd day, while the blizzard was still raging outside, Jake had created something unprecedented. The interior temperature of his rebuilt cabin was holding steady at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, while similar structures in the area were barely managing to stay above freezing. He'd accomplished this using only materials available within a day's walk of the site, and techniques he'd learned from cultures that white society generally dismissed as primitive. The psychological impact of this transformation was just as important as the technical achievement. Jake wasn't just surviving in the wilderness, he was thriving, he was comfortable, and comfort in the 1840s frontier was rarer than gold. Most settlers were just hanging on, enduring each day, hoping to make it through another winter. Jake had created a space where he could actually live, not just exist. What makes this story even more compelling is what it says about knowledge transfer between cultures. Jake had taken Shoshone Earth Lodge principles, Ute snow survival techniques, and Pennsylvania engineering know-how, and synthesized them into something entirely new. He wasn't just copying native techniques or imposing European methods. He was creating hybrid solutions that were better than either approach alone. But here's the thing about frontier legends. They spread fast, and they grow in the telling. By spring of 1842, word about the crazy mountain man with the impossibly warm cabin was traveling through trading posts and settlements across the territory. Some people called him a genius. Others said he'd made a deal with the devil. Most just called him mad. They had no idea what was coming next. Because Jake Brennan wasn't done innovating. That first winter was just his proof of concept. He had plans, big plans, for turning his little experiment into something that would change how people survived in the American West. And he was about to get his chance to prove that madness and genius sometimes wear the same face. The question wasn't whether Jake's methods worked. The question was whether anyone would be smart enough to listen to him before winter claimed more lives than it had to. Spring came to Skull Ridge Pass in 1842, and with it, Jake Brennan's true ambitions began to unfold. The blizzard had been his laboratory, but now he had an entire construction season ahead of him. What he'd accomplished in those first 72 hours was just the beginning. Jake had a vision that went far beyond simply staying warm. He was going to build something that would redefine what was possible in frontier architecture. The foundation work alone would have impressed a Philadelphia contractor. Jake had learned from Shoshone Earth Lodge construction that the secret wasn't just going deep, it was understanding how Earth temperature worked. At 6 feet down, the ground maintains a constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Most frontier builders never thought about this. They'd slap together a cabin on whatever level ground they could find and wonder why their floors were ice-cold come winter. Jake dug his foundation to precisely that 6-foot mark, but here's where his engineering background really showed. Instead of just creating a basement, he designed what we'd now recognize as a geothermal heat exchange system. He carved channels into the earth walls and lined them with stones, creating pathways for air circulation that would pre-warm incoming air and capture heat from the earth itself. Remember, this is 1842. The first practical geothermal systems wouldn't be patented for another 80 years. The timber work showcased that fusion of techniques that made Jake so unique. He'd learned from the Ute that certain woods worked better in specific applications, but his Pennsylvania experience taught him about load distribution and structural engineering. The result was a frame system that used smaller logs than typical frontier construction, but distributed weight more efficiently. Each log was carefully selected, seasoned using native smoking techniques, and fitted using European joinery methods. But the real innovation was happening with what Jake called his breathing walls. Most cabins of this era were built with the philosophy that tighter meant warmer. Jake understood that this was completely backwards. He'd watched Shoshone builders create walls that allowed controlled air circulation, preventing moisture buildup that would rot the structure from the inside. But simply copying their techniques wouldn't work with timber construction, so Jake invented something new. He created double wall construction with a controlled air gap. The inner wall was his buffalo blood mixture, providing thermal mass and moisture control. The outer wall was traditional chinked logs, providing structural strength and weather protection. Between them was a carefully calculated airspace that allowed moisture to escape while preventing heat loss. Modern building science calls this a rain screen system. Jake was doing it instinctively based on his understanding of how air and moisture behaved. The heating system he designed that summer was pure genius, and this is where the story gets almost unbelievable. Jake created a central fire pit, but instead of just heating the air directly, he built 12 underground clay pipes radiating out from the fire like spokes on a wheel. These pipes, each about 8 inches in diameter, carried heated air under the floor and up through vents in the walls, creating convection currents that circulated warm air throughout the entire space. The engineering behind this was sophisticated beyond anything being done in settled territories. Jake had calculated airflow, heat transfer, and thermal dynamics using nothing but intuition and observation. The system could maintain interior temperatures between 68 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit, using roughly half the fuel of a conventional fireplace. Half. In an era when gathering firewood was backbreaking daily work, Jake had just solved one of frontier life's biggest problems. But here's where the story takes a turn that really shows you what kind of man Jake Brennan was. In late August of 1842, he had a visitor. Not a friendly trader or a lost traveller, but a massive grizzly bear that had apparently decided Jake's improved cabin smelled interesting enough to investigate. Now, most sane people would have hidden inside and hoped the bear would lose interest. Jake grabbed his rifle and walked outside to have a conversation. What happened next became the stuff of legend, but we know it really happened because Jake kept the bear's hide for the rest of his life, and multiple witnesses saw it over the years. The confrontation lasted nearly an hour. The bear was easily 7 feet tall when it reared up, probably weighed 600 pounds, and was clearly not intimidated by this strange human who refused to run away. Jake didn't shoot immediately. He later told people he was trying to determine if the bear was sick, rabid, or just curious. When the bear finally charged, Jake's single shot dropped it at 20 yards. But here's the part that really established Jake's reputation. He didn't just kill the bear and celebrate. He spent the next 3 days processing every part of that animal. The meat went into his smokehouse. The fat became lamp oil and waterproofing compound. The bones became tools. And that magnificent hide became the lining for his cabin walls, adding another layer of insulation that would prove crucial in the months ahead. Word of the bear incident spread faster than wildfire through the territorial trading network. Suddenly, Jake Brennan wasn't just the crazy guy with the warm cabin. He was the crazy guy with the warm cabin who could stare down a grizzly bear and win. In frontier society, that kind of reputation was better than currency. The timing couldn't have been better, because in September, Jake received his first official visitor. William Hartley, a territorial surveyor working for the federal government, arrived at Skullridge Pass as part of a broader mapping expedition. Hartley was educated, experienced, and completely unprepared for what he found. Hartley's journal, which survived and is now held by the Colorado Historical Society, describes his amazement at Jake's innovations. He writes about interior temperatures that seemed impossible, air circulation systems that defied conventional understanding, and construction techniques that combined materials and methods he'd never seen used together. Most importantly, Hartley was qualified to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't just frontier tall tales, this was documented verification by a trained professional. But Hartley's visit also marked the beginning of Jake's transformation, from isolated innovator to regional power broker. The surveyor brought news that railroad scouts were already planning routes through the territory. Settlers were coming in increasing numbers. The frontier was about to become much less frontier-like, and Jake's innovations were about to be tested on a scale he'd never imagined. The question was whether Jake Brennan was ready to become more than just a legend, because winter was coming again, and this time he wouldn't be facing it alone. The winter of 1843 would go down in territorial records as the winter of death, and for good reason. By November, temperatures had already dropped to levels that old-timers said they'd never seen. By December, the snow was falling so consistently that some areas accumulated depths of 12 to 15 feet. By January, people were dying. Not from accidents, not from disease, not from violence. They were freezing to death in their own cabins. 47 documented deaths across the territory, all from hypothermia in structures that were supposed to provide shelter. Conventional frontier construction was failing catastrophically, and Jake Brennan's little experiment at Skullridge Pass was about to become the difference between life and death for nearly 100 desperate souls. The first arrivals came in late November. A family named Patterson, traveling with 3 young children, had been caught by an early blizzard that lasted 6 days. Their wagon was stuck somewhere in the valley below, buried under snow that wouldn't melt until spring. They'd heard rumors about a mountain man with an impossibly warm cabin, and desperation had driven them to climb towards Skullridge Pass in weather that should have killed them. When Jake opened his door to find this half-frozen family on his doorstep, he faced a decision that would define the rest of his story. His cabin was designed for 1 person, maybe 2 in a pinch. Taking in 5 people would strain his heating system, his food supplies, and his carefully calculated living space. Most frontier dwellers would have offered what help they could and sent the family on their way. Jake Brennan was not most frontier dwellers. He brought them inside. What happened over the next 48 hours demonstrated something remarkable about Jake's innovations. His heating system didn't just scale up, it actually became more efficient with more people. The additional body heat worked with his convection design to create an even more comfortable environment. The Pattersons went from near-death hypothermia to sleeping soundly in shirt sleeves within 12 hours. But word travels fast in desperate times, and the Pattersons were just the beginning. By December, Jake's cabin had become a known refuge throughout the territory. Traders spread the word at every settlement. If you're caught in the mountains during a killing storm, head for Skull Ridge Pass. The mountain man will take you in. This put Jake in an impossible position. His cabin could realistically house maybe 20 people without compromising the systems that kept everyone alive. But people kept coming, and Jake kept taking them in. The solution he developed showcased the same innovative thinking that had created his heating system in the first place. Instead of just cramming more people into the same space, Jake expanded the space itself. Using techniques he'd learned from watching Utah winter camps, he began constructing semi-permanent shelters that could tap into his central heating system. Picture this. Jake's original cabin became the hub, with satellite shelters radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Each shelter was connected to the central heating system through carefully insulated underground channels. He was essentially creating the territory's first climate-controlled village, using nothing but materials he could gather from the immediate area. The engineering challenges were staggering. Each additional shelter required precise calculations of airflow, heat distribution, and structural integrity. Too much heat draw from the central system, and everyone would freeze. Too little, and the new arrivals would die anyway. Jake was doing complex thermodynamic calculations in his head while working 16-hour days in sub-zero temperatures. By January of 1843, Jake's expanded compound housed 63 people. Families, solo travelers, traders caught by storms, even a circuit preacher who'd been making rounds when the weather turned deadly. It should have been chaos. Instead, it became something unprecedented in frontier history, a functioning community built around shared survival. The diversity of Jake's temporary residence created fascinating cultural dynamics. The Westbrook wagon train, which arrived in early January, included families from Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Ohio. Sarah Westbrook was 8 months pregnant when they reached the compound, and she gave birth to her daughter by the warmth of Jake's central fire pit, while a blizzard raged outside that killed 3 people in cabins just 20 miles away. But perhaps the most remarkable relationship was between Jake and Speaking River, a Ute elder who arrived with his family after their winter camp was destroyed by an avalanche. Most white settlers would have been uncomfortable housing native peoples, and most native peoples would have been suspicious of white hospitality. But Jake's decade living among the Shoshone and Ute had given him credibility, and Speaking River recognized the sophistication of Jake's engineering. What developed was an extraordinary knowledge exchange. Speaking River taught the children traditional songs and stories during the long winter evenings, while Jake learned advanced weather prediction techniques that would serve him for years. The old Ute showed Jake how to read wind patterns and cloud formations with an accuracy that rivaled any scientific instruments of the era. The psychological impact of this cultural mixing cannot be overstated. Children who might have grown up with typical frontier prejudices instead learned that survival depended on cooperation regardless of background. Adults who had never interacted with people from different cultures found themselves sharing meals, stories, and responsibilities. Jake's compound became an accidental experiment in frontier integration. By February, word of Jake's success had reached territorial authorities, and he received visitors that would change his trajectory permanently. Union Pacific advance scouts, led by a man named Thomas Morrison, no relation to the original cabin builder, arrived at Skull Ridge Pass with an offer that was part business proposition, part government contract. The railroad was coming through the territory within 5 years, Morrison explained. They needed way stations, supply depots, and most importantly, proven techniques for keeping people alive in extreme weather. Jake's innovations weren't just locally useful, they represented solutions to problems the railroad would face across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The negotiation that followed demonstrated Jake's evolution from hermit innovator to strategic thinker. He agreed to share his heating and construction techniques with Union Pacific engineers, but only in exchange for guaranteed supply lines, territorial protection, and formal recognition of his land claims. He wasn't just trading his knowledge, he was positioning himself as an essential partner in the region's development. When spring finally arrived in March of 1843, Jake's compound had achieved something that seemed impossible. Of the 93 people who had sought shelter at Skull Ridge Pass during the Winter of Death, every single one survived. Not just survived, but thrived. Children had gained weight. Adults had recovered from injuries and illnesses. Several women had given birth to healthy babies. Meanwhile, across the territory, 47 people had frozen to death in conventional cabins. The contrast was so stark that it couldn't be ignored. Jake Brennan had proven that frontier survival didn't have to be a desperate struggle against impossible odds. With the right techniques, the right understanding of natural systems, and the right approach to community cooperation, even the worst winter in territorial history could be not just survived, but mastered. But Jake was about to face his greatest challenge yet. Because success brings attention, and attention brings complications that even the most innovative mountain man might not be prepared to handle. Jake Brennan disappeared on March 15, 1845, during the first major snowmelt of spring. He left behind no note, no explanation, no forwarding address. What he did leave was something far more valuable, a network of people who understood his techniques and the knowledge to spread them across the Rocky Mountain territories. The disappearance wasn't sudden or mysterious in the way frontier legends usually claim. Jake had been planning this exit for months, methodically training a core group of builders in his construction methods, while establishing supply relationships that could function without his direct involvement. He transformed from innovator to teacher to systematic organizer, and by the time he walked away from Skull Ridge Pass, his innovations had taken on a life of their own. The training program Jake established during the winter of 1844 was unlike anything seen in frontier territories. Instead of the typical apprentice system where techniques were closely guarded secrets, Jake actively recruited people to learn his methods. He identified individuals with natural building instincts, mechanical aptitude, or simply the determination to master something new. Thomas Whitman, a carpenter from the failed Westbrook wagon train, became Jake's most dedicated student. Whitman had lost everything when his family decided to return east after the Winter of Death, but he'd seen enough of Jake's work to understand its revolutionary potential. He spent 14 months at Skull Ridge Pass, learning not just the techniques but the underlying principles that made them work. Sarah Mitchell, the widow of a trader who died in a conventional cabin during that terrible winter, proved to have an intuitive grasp of the heating systems that surprised even Jake. She could diagnose problems with airflow or heat distribution that trained carpenters missed entirely. Jake taught her the mathematical relationships behind his calculations, making her perhaps the only woman in the territory who understood thermodynamics at a practical level. By spring of 1845, Jake had trained 17 people in his complete system. More importantly, he'd taught them how to adapt his techniques to different materials, different climates, different local conditions. He wasn't just spreading a single design. He was spreading a way of thinking about construction that prioritized efficiency, sustainability, and human comfort. The economic network Jake established was equally sophisticated. His agreements with Union Pacific had evolved into formal contracts that guaranteed steady income for anyone building to his specifications. Territorial authorities, impressed by the Winter of Death survival statistics, were offering land grants and tax incentives for communities that adopted his heating systems. Jake had created not just better buildings, but a profitable industry around better buildings. When Jake finally walked away from Skull Ridge Pass, he left the cabin and all its innovations to Thomas Whitman, along with detailed written instructions for maintaining and improving the systems. But more importantly, he left behind people who were already spreading his techniques throughout the territory. The impact was immediate and measurable. Fort Laramie, the critical supply depot for Western migration, incorporated Jake's ventilation design into their new barracks construction in 1846. The result was a 70% reduction in respiratory illness among soldiers and a 40% reduction in heating costs. Military engineers documented every detail, ensuring that similar designs would be used in frontier installations across the West. The town of Silver Creek, Colorado, faced a crisis in 1851 when an early winter caught them with inadequate shelter for a population swollen by mining activity. Thomas Whitman arrived in October with a crew of Jake-trained builders, and they constructed emergency shelters using the satellite system Jake had pioneered during the Winter of Death. When the worst blizzard in regional history struck in December, Silver Creek recorded 0 weather-related deaths, while neighboring mining camps lost dozens of people. But perhaps the most remarkable validation of Jake's work came in the 20th century, when University of Colorado engineering students began studying the preserved Skull Ridge Pass cabin as part of a research project on historical building techniques. Using modern instruments and computer modeling, they confirmed what frontier residents had experienced firsthand. Jake's heating system achieved thermal efficiency levels that wouldn't be matched by conventional construction until the 1970s. The thermal mass calculations were perfect. The convection design optimized air circulation in ways that modern HVAC engineers struggle to achieve. The insulation values of his buffalo blood mixture exceeded contemporary synthetic materials. Most remarkably, the moisture control systems prevented the rot and structural degradation that destroyed most frontier buildings within decades. The cabin itself still stands, now protected as a National Historic Site. Park rangers report that even without active heating, the structure maintains interior temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than outside conditions. Visitors in winter are startled to find themselves comfortable in shirt sleeves while snow falls outside. The central heating system, though no longer used, remains intact and functional after nearly 2 centuries. Modern archaeologists studying the site have identified evidence of Jake's broader compound system. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped the underground heat distribution channels, revealing an engineering project of staggering scope and precision. What appeared to casual observers as a simple mountain cabin was actually the hub of a sophisticated climate control network that covered nearly 3 acres. The human legacy proved equally enduring. Genealogical research has traced the families Jake saved during the Winter of Death throughout the American West. Their descendants became prominent in dozens of communities, carrying not just survival but the memory of how cooperation and innovation could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Sarah Westbrook's daughter, born by Jake's central fire during that terrible winter, grew up to become one of Colorado's first female architects. Speaking River's grandson became a respected meteorologist whose weather prediction techniques combined traditional native knowledge with scientific methods. The cultural fusion that occurred in Jake's compound during those desperate months created ripple effects that lasted for generations. The question of what happened to Jake Brennan himself remains one of the territory's great mysteries. Some say he returned to live among the Shoshone. Others claim he headed to California or Oregon, carrying his innovations to new frontiers. A few insist he simply decided that his work was done and chose to disappear rather than become a public figure. But maybe the mystery is the point. Jake Brennan proved that one person with knowledge, determination, and the wisdom to learn from other cultures could fundamentally change how people survived and thrived in hostile environments. His innovations saved lives, created communities, and demonstrated that frontier hardship wasn't inevitable. In a time when most people simply endured whatever nature threw at them, Jake Brennan chose to engineer solutions. And those solutions outlasted the man himself, proving that the best innovations aren't just clever ideas but foundations for others to build upon. The cabin still stands, the techniques still work, and somewhere in the design of every energy-efficient building, every climate-controlled space, every structure that prioritizes human comfort over mere survival, there's an echo of the mad mountain man who looked at a leaking cabin and saw the possibility of something better.